Alright guys, this video focuses on the Egyptian pantheon and the gods and goddesses that are in that mythology. So the first one is Ra, also known as Re or sometimes Amun-Ra. He's the king of the gods. He's basically the Zeus equivalent in Egyptian mythology. He is a sun god, and actually he's the one who's responsible for moving the sun through the sky during the day and then through the underworld at night, where he has to fight off monsters, which is a little strange. Often he's depicted as a man with a falcon head and a sun on his head. There's another falcon-headed god. Try not to get them confused. So he is seen as the creator of men. And as I said, he's very, very important because they think of him as the sun. And every night he dies. And in the morning, he is reborn as the sun and he traverses the world. And then he dies again at night and goes through the underworld. As such, the phoenix is another one of his popular symbols. Next, we have Osiris, and he's sometimes thought of as a son of Ra, sometimes not. It kind of depends on the story, but he's the god of earth and vegetation, but also of pharaohs. He's a symbol for the yearly drought and then the subsequent flooding of the Nile. And he's responsible for giving Egypt what they thought of as their civilization. He has a sister named Isis, who he's also married to. Again, this is kind of like Zeus and Hera. The sister-wife thing wasn't as odd then as it would be now. He's in charge of ruling Egypt, but when he was killed by the god Set and a bunch of other conspirators, Isis, his wife slash sister, is the one that's left in charge of Egypt. He was chopped up into tons and tons of tiny pieces when he was killed. And the way that Isis brought him back to life was by rounding up all of these pieces of his body, putting him back together. And then the few pieces that she couldn't find, she made out of clay and used those to resurrect him. He's also the king of the afterlife. He's often shown as a man with a beard, and he's often holding the flail and the crook, which are both symbols of pharaohs and of divinity and of the monarchy. For some reason, his skin is often depicted as green. I don't know if it's because he is mummified or because he's decaying or because that's just the color of his skin. It's really not known. But he is often wrapped up, so he'll be shown in white as well, is another way to think of Osiris. This is his wife, Isis, and she's often shown as a winged woman or a woman who wears a headdress with a vulture on it and sometimes a pair of horns. Sometimes she has a sun disk on there as well. She was thought of as the mother of pharaohs, and often it was argued that pharaohs would have suckled from her or breastfed from her when they were young. Again, just showing that the pharaohs were divine in Egypt. They weren't thought of as just random people. They were divine people who were also in charge of the country. She's also in charge of creating the cobra, and the reason she did that was the sun god Ra was very old, and he wasn't leaving the sky as quickly as he was supposed to. So the sun shining constantly meant that a bunch of crops were dying and water was evaporating that shouldn't. So she actually created a cobra, had it bite him, and then while he was sick and dying, he revealed his secret name to her, which she used to make sure that he set properly, like he was supposed to. Because of her sacrifices, because of how she saves Osiris from his fate by Set, she's often seen as this pure example of a loving wife, of a loving mother, and motherhood. Horus is another falcon-headed god, but again, it doesn't have the sun on there. And the pharaoh is supposed to be his earthly embodiment. So he's the son of Osiris and Isis, and Set also hates Horus. He hates Osiris and he hates Horus. In art, he's often shown standing on crocodiles to show his dominance over them. Set is sometimes associated with crocodiles as well. He has several sons born from his mother Isis, again, kind of strange, but each one of these gods is in charge of a certain organ during the mummification process. And the stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines were thought of as the most important organs in the human body. You'll notice the heart and the brain, the two that we often think are the most important, aren't actually featured, which is strange, but these are the ones that they thought were the most important. The brain is actually completely destroyed in the mummification process. Oftentimes they would stick a sharpened stake up the nose of the dead person and swirl it around so that the brain would liquefy, and then they would pour it out through the nostrils. So you're welcome for that little thing. So this is the god Set. He's the god of evil, the desert, storms, and chaos. He's often seen as a devil figure. There are very few redeeming things about Set. He hates Osiris and Ra because he's jealous of both of them. He kills Osiris, becomes king for a little while, but again, he's killed by Horus, and Isis ends up thwarting Set's whole thing by resurrecting Osiris. He's sometimes thought of as part pig and part donkey is what his face is supposed to be, but there are other things that just refer to him as a Set monster. So we're not really sure what he's supposed to be, but he is definitely very, very evil. So this is the goddess Nephthys. She is the wife of Seth, and she is known for seducing Osiris. Either she gets him drunk or she pretends to look like Isis, his wife. The stories change depending on who's telling the mythology. And she becomes pregnant with Anubis, who's another god that we see. She's best friends with Isis, though by being married to Set is clearly maybe evil. It just kind of depends. This is the god Anubis, and he's the son of Nephthys, and sometimes it's Set, sometimes it's Ra. It just kind of depends. He is often depicted with the head of a jackal, who the Egyptians associated with death, and it's his job to guide the dead into the underworld. He weighs their heart on a scale against a feather, and if your heart weighs more than the feather, that means that your heart is full of evil and bad deeds, so you are eaten by this monster, which we'll talk about in a second. Or if your heart weighs less than the feather, it means that it is light and not full of sin, and you've done good deeds in your life, and you are free to go on to the underworld and continue kind of living, kind of not. He works with Osiris in the underworld because Osiris, because he died, is also a big part of the underworld. He's also the god that is associated the most with mummification. This is Ammit. This is the monster that I was talking about. She's known as the Eater of the Dead, and she stands by those scales while the hearts are being weighed, and whoever is too wicked, she eats their hearts, and they die for good. They don't get any immortality in the underworld. She is depicted as the head of a crocodile, the body of a leopard, and the hind legs of a hippo, which I imagine made it very hard to move around, as those hippo legs look very, very short there at the bottom, but hopefully it's not too much of a problem for her. So she eats every evil heart so that they don't get reborn in the underworld. This is Aten. We won't talk a whole lot about this, but Aten is the actual sun, the actual disk of the sun that we see, not the representation that is Ra, but the actual sun. And often it's depicted as a disk with rays coming down, and these rays often end in hands. As you can see, they're holding things. And there's another thought that Aten might have been the one that created human beings instead of Ra. This is Nut. She's the sky, so she's often depicted as either a woman with wings or as a naked woman arching over the earth, covered in stars, as you can see in these two pictures. So she and her brother Geb, which is the earth, could not stop holding hands, procreating, whatever you want to call it. So now their father, Air, stands in between them, holding them apart. And that's why we have the sky arching far above the earth as opposed to directly on top of it. This is Thoth, moon god, but also the god of writing and of scholars and of recording. He's often depicted with the head of an ibis, and he's often holding a stylus and papyrus. Papyrus would have been what they wrote with, and then a stylus would have been a pen that was created from reeds that they would use to write. He's in charge of recording the weights of the hearts in the underworld, and again, coming up with the Egyptian form of writing, which are hieroglyphics. This is Bast. She's one of the more well-known ones. She's often depicted as a woman with a cat's head. She's the goddess of love, sex, childbirth, so women often prayed to Bast to keep them safe, to keep their children safe, to make their pregnancies go easily. The cats are sacred to her, hence the cat head, and very often cats were mummified in her honor. So they would be killed, mummified, and kept in her temples. The live ones were also kept in her temples as well. We also have Bes, who was a household god. He's often depicted as this weird little dwarf with a strange beard, and his job was to frighten evil spirits away. He sometimes is associated with a goddess of childbirth called Taweret, who is a little creepy looking. He was even adopted by Roman soldiers. They would wear amulets with his face on them for protection, but again, just to frighten evil spirits away. This is Happy. He's the god of the Nile floods. And the reason the floods were so important to the Egyptians is because they were the main reason that any of their land was fertile and able to be farmed. So what would happen is the land on either side of the Nile would flood, and the Nile would deposit silt and all kinds of wonderful minerals that they needed to fertilize the ground. Once the land was fertilized, the Nile would recede, and then they could plant on all those floodplains. So the Nile was incredibly, sorry about that bell. The Nile was incredibly important to them, and was the main source of their food, their livelihood, everything. So Hapi was the god that was in charge of that. He keeps the land and the river fertile, and he's often depicted as having long hair, a bit of a pot belly, and even boobs, weirdly enough, which are all symbols of fertility. He's often depicted as blue because of the river. And in some areas where agriculture was incredibly important, he was even worshipped over Ra. He was more important to those people. This is Neith. She's a minor goddess. She's often thought of as a mother goddess, and she's the one that we have to blame for childbirth. She was in charge of creating gods, humans, and animals, and she was also a warrior goddess. Her spit is also one of the reasons why there is a giant serpent in the underworld called Apep, and that is one of the things that Ra has to fight every single night when he is setting as the sun and moving through the underworld. This is Sekhmet. She's often depicted as having a lion's head. She's the wife of Ptah. He was an early creator god. He was also the god of craftsmen, so jewelers and potters, and all these people would pray to Ptah to get things. She was pretty cool in that she was able to breathe fire against her enemies, and she's in charge of delivering punishment to the gods when it's necessary. So she's pretty cool. That should give you a pretty good overview of the gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Make sure that you take notes on this so that when you take your quiz on it, you are all set. Thanks, guys.